Hello sports fans, welcome to Super Sports Central. Today, we're going to be going over my college football playoff semifinal predictions. So in the quarterfinals, I was not very good, going just 1-3, and in the playoffs, I also haven't been great, as I'm just 3-5. But hopefully we can turn that around this week. And now my overall record on the season, including the playoffs, is 209-64. But we'll start off with the Fiesta Bowl on Thursday with Miami against Ole Miss. So Miami, they're 12-2, and coming off a huge upset win over Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. And they face Ole Miss, who's 13-1, and also coming off a huge upset win, as they beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl, winning 39-34. But this is a really interesting matchup, because these are two really good teams, but they do things a lot differently. As for Miami, they want to control the line of scrimmage, run the football, and play great defense. But for Ole Miss, they want to go fast and put up a ton of points. But with how different these two teams are, it's going to be a very interesting matchup. But the offense for Miami, they're putting up 31.6 points per game, and they've been great on the ground, as on the season, they're rushing for 152 yards per game. And they've also run the ball very effectively so far in the playoffs, as they ran for 175 against Texas A&M in the first round, and last week against Ohio State, they ran for 153. Now, Carson Beck hasn't really been anything too impressive, as he threw for just 103 against A&M, and 138 last week against Ohio State, but Miami also hasn't needed him to do very much with how effectively they've run the football. But the Miami offense, they match up against an Ole Miss defense that's pretty solid, as they're allowing 20.4 points per game. Although the defense for Ole Miss is nothing too impressive against the run, as they're allowing 146 rushing yards per game. Although in the quarterfinals, they did play pretty well against Georgia, as they held them to 124. Now that's definitely nothing too impressive, but they were much better against the run in the second half, and I do think that's a big reason they were able to win the game. And I think Ole Miss needs to go with the same strategy defensively this week. They need to stop the run and force Miami to beat them through the air, because it's what they did against Georgia, and it worked. So if they can force Carson Beck to throw the football, maybe force him in a couple turnovers, I definitely think that could be a good recipe for success. Now, on the flip side, the offense for Ole Miss, they're great. They're scoring 37.6 points per game, and they're very balanced with 315 passing yards per game and 180 rushing yards per game. And Trinidad Chambliss has been insane, and last week he could not be stopped, as he threw for 362 yards and 2 touchdowns. But Trinidad Chambliss and the Ole Miss offense, they faced an elite Miami defense that has dominated so far in the playoffs, as they've held Texas A&M to just 3 points, and against Ohio State in the quarterfinals, they held them to 14. And on the season, Miami is giving up just 13.1 points per game. But this is a game that could really go either way, and I'm very interested to see how these teams match up against one another with their two contrasting styles. But I could really see this game going one of two ways. The first way, Miami controls the line of scrimmage, they run the football effectively, their defense contains the Ole Miss offense, and they end up winning. But the second way is Ole Miss, they contain the Miami run game, they force Carson Beck to throw the football, maybe force him in a few turnovers, and the Ole Miss offense also has success. And if that happens, then I think Trinidad Chambliss easily outplays Carson Beck, Ole Miss outscores Miami, and they end up winning. But this game can really go either way, and I have no idea who to pick. Now, I would like to see Ole Miss with the win, but I'm going to take Miami. Just the way they've dominated up front so far in the playoffs has been really impressive, and I don't really want to pick against that. Plus, we've seen Miami play a similar style team in the playoffs when they beat Texas A&M, and in that game their defense dominated, allowing just 3 points. Now, I do think Ole Miss has a better offense because they have a better downfield pass game, even though Texas A&M's offense is pretty good, and they're very similar with how they want to generate explosive plays. I just think Ole Miss, they've got the better quarterback, they got the better chance to put up more points. I do think they end up scoring a lot more than 3 points, but I just think Miami, the little bit better overall team here. I trust their ability along the line of scrimmage, and I've got them with the win by a score of 24-20. And moving on to the other semifinal game, we've got the Peach Bowl on Friday between Oregon and Indiana. And this is going to be another great game, as Oregon is 13-1 and coming off a dominant 23-0 win over Texas Tech. And Indiana, they're 14-0, they're still undefeated, and they dominate Alabama, winning 38-3 in the Rose Bowl. But this is also a rematch of a game we saw in the regular season, and in that game, Indiana went to Oregon and they won 30-20. But it's hard to beat a good team twice, and it's going to be a very interesting matchup. But the offense for Indiana, they're obviously great. They're putting up 41.6 points per game, and they're very balanced, with 247 passing yards per game and 220 rushing yards per game. But they match up against the Oregon defense that's great, as they're allowing just 15.1 points per game, and they absolutely dominated last week against Texas Tech, obviously not allowing a single point. Now, on the flip side, the offense for Oregon, they're also good, as they're putting up 38 points, and they're also incredibly balanced, as they're throwing for 251 yards per game and rushing for 206 yards per game. And Oregon, they've also got a very deep running back room, as Noah Whittington, Jordan Davison, and De'Aaron Hill Jr. all have run for at least 500 yards and 5 scores this season. But the Oregon offense, they match up against an elite Indiana defense, as they're second best in the country, giving up just 10.3 points per game, and they're also second best against the run, allowing to 73.7 rushing yards per game and 2.8 yards per carry. And in the first meeting between these two teams, Indiana's defense played really well, as they allowed just 13 offensive points. But the Oregon offense against the Indiana defense is where I really think this game ends up getting decided. Because if the Oregon offense can score against the Indiana defense, then I think Oregon has the defense to slow down Fernando Mendoza and the Indiana offense. But it's definitely a big if Oregon can score, because last week they did not play that well. Now, they did end up scoring 23 points against Texas Tech, who does have a great defense, but they couldn't run the football, they didn't throw it impressively well, and they were also consistently getting great starting field position with all the turnovers the defense forced. Now, while I do think this is a good Oregon offense, they also have struggled against great defenses, because they didn't play that well against Indiana the first time, they weren't very good last week, and they also only scored 18 against Iowa. But this is another game that can definitely go either way, and it's hard to beat a good team twice, but I'm going to take Indiana to beat Oregon for the second time. They've already beaten them in Oregon, they should be able to beat them at a neutral site. Plus, I just trust this Indiana defense. I think they're going to be able to slow down this Oregon offense, and I think their offense does enough, even if it's a good defense. So I'm going to take Indiana to get the win in a lower scoring defensive game by a score of 24-16. But those are my college ball playoff semifinal predictions. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications. I do my best to post as often as possible. Be sure to check out the post tab on my channel, where you guys can vote on who you think wins semifinal games. But thank you guys for watching. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.